Four men destroy private property, tear open a ceiling to lower their paralyzed friend, and what they get for their spectacular effort is not a healing, but a declaration that detonates silent fury and sounds like straight blasphemy.
It really is probably one of the most jarring, unexpected bait and switches you will ever find in ancient literature.
Yeah.
You have this massive, physically dramatic buildup, right?
Right, exactly.
And the payoff is just a complete, total pivot that catches everyone in the room entirely off guard.
And it changes absolutely everything. I mean, if you are listening to this right now, we are about to pull back the curtain on a text you probably think you know inside and out.
Oh, definitely. People think it's just, a nice healing story.
Exactly. But the biggest revelation of this deep dive, the real aha moment you are going to walk away with today, is that the physical miracles in this ancient text, they're actually just footnotes.
Yeah, that's the crazy part.
Yeah. The real story you are about to uncover in Mark chapter 2 is a calculated, systematic takedown of a massive, heavily guarded political and religious power structure. We are talking about the dismantling of an entire societal order, step by step, right out in the open.
Which is incredibly dangerous to do in a first-century context,
Yeah.
You do not just challenge the central authorities of an occupied nation and expect to walk away quietly.
No, you really don't. But before we get into the architecture, the history, and the sheer audacity of how that happens, we have to establish a baseline. Like, why would telling a paralyzed man your sins are forgiven instantly put a target on a teacher's back and threaten an entire national economy?
That is the core mystery, isn't it?
It is. Keep that in the back of your mind as we set the scene. Okay, let's unpack this. We are in Capernaum. Give us the physical reality of what this moment actually looks and feels like.
Well, first off, Capernaum is not some polished, marble-columned royal city. It sits right on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee.
So it's basically a working town, right?
Yeah, it's a gritty fishing and trade village.
Hmm.
And the architecture reflects that reality perfectly. The town is built primarily from the region's dark basalt stone.
Which is notoriously hard to work with.
Exactly. This stone is incredibly hard, very difficult to carve into neat blocks, so the houses are essentially rough fieldstones stacked together. They're tightly clustered along very narrow alleyways.
And based on the archaeological excavations from our sources, we know exactly how these structures operated. We are talking about single-story, maybe two-story houses packed tightly together.
With packed earth floors, right?
Yeah, and the roofs were completely flat. But they weren't made of stone. They were constructed from thick wooden beams spanning the walls, which were then heavily layered with thatch, brush, and packed clay to keep the rain out.
Which is a brilliant piece of architectural context for understanding the sheer mechanics of this opening scene.
How so?
Well, that specific construction wooden crossbeams layered with clay and brush is precisely the kind of structure that a group of determined people could actually dig open from above.
Oh, I see, without the whole building collapsing.
Right. You could claw through the packed clay and pull back the branches without bringing the structural stone walls crashing down on the massive crowd packed inside.
Plus, exterior stone staircases were totally standard in Capernaum. People used their flat roofs all the time as extra living space, for drying fish or sleeping in the summer.
Exactly. So getting 4 guys and a man on a mat up to the roof.
That was the easy part.
Yeah, that was just stairs. But intentionally destroying the roof, clawing through the clay while a teacher is speaking below, that is an entirely different level of disruption.
Imagine the dirt and debris just raining down on the VIPs sitting in the front row.
The physical exertion alone is staggering, but the social audacity is what really sets the stage here.
Yeah, the deliberate destruction of someone else's private property just to interrupt a teaching and reach the rabbi below.
It is an extraordinary, almost violent breach of social norms. It demonstrates a level of absolute desperation. These men believe that if they can just get their friend in front of this specific teacher, a physical miracle is guaranteed.
So picture this incredibly cinematic, high-tension moment. The roof is literally torn open. The sunlight streams into this dark, dusty, packed house.
The crowd inside is completely captivated.
Right. The locals came for a miracle. The scribes, who have traveled to be there, came to observe and assess this new teacher. And the paralyzed man on the mat, who has just been lowered down by ropes, presumably came to walk again.
Everyone is waiting for the magic words, like, stand up.
But Jesus completely bypasses all of their expectations. He looks at the man on the floor, and instead of addressing his paralyzed legs, he addresses his spiritual state.
He looks right at him and says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And you can practically hear the oxygen leave the room.
It is the ultimate left turn. Only after exposing the scribe's silent internal fury over this completely unexpected statement does he actually perform the physical cure.
He essentially makes the healing secondary.
Exactly. It functions as nothing more than evidence submitted in an argument about his own authority.
Right. The guy rolling up his mat and walking out the door is less the point than the massive, earth-shattering claim that was just staked in front of all these witnesses.
But hold on, I have to push back here.
Okay, lay it on me.
If some random guy in my living room suddenly declares that he has the power to forgive sins on behalf of God, I don't see him as an existential threat to the global economy. I just write him off as a lunatic who has been out in the Galilean sun too long.
That's a fair point for a modern context, sure.
So why do these highly educated legal scholars view this peasant carpenter as an immediate existential threat instead of just laughing him out of the room?
What's fascinating here is the massive institutional and economic weight of what just occurred.
Okay, walk me through that.
To truly understand their silent fury, we have to look closely at Mark 2.7, where the scribes ask in their hearts, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" This is absolutely not just a minor theological disagreement about semantics.
Right, because in first century Judean society, the scribes aren't just scholars reading books in a library.
Exactly. They are the legal experts. Their authority and their entire societal standing derive from their absolute mastery of Torah interpretation.
They are the closest thing to a professional judiciary in a world where religious law and civil law are the exact same thing.
Yes. So when Jesus bypasses them and says, "Your sins are forgiven," he isn't just offering some nice pastoral comfort to a hurting guy. He's stepping onto their turf.
He's stepping onto their turf and completely invalidating their process.
Totally invalidating it. He is performing a function that strictly legally belonged to the temple apparatus in Jerusalem.
Right, because in their highly structured system, forgiveness wasn't just a concept, it was an entire logistical process.
It was administered by the authorized priesthood, and it had to be validated by blood sacrifice.
You had to travel to the temple, you had to bring an unblemished animal or buy one there.
You had to have a priest mediate the transaction between you and God. You couldn't just have some guy declare it for free in a dusty living room in a fishing village.
Because if you can get forgiveness for free in Capernaum, the entire logistical supply chain of Jerusalem collapses. Bypassing the temple isn't just bad theology, it's bad for business.
It is an economic disaster for the ruling class. The temple apparatus generated massive, incalculable revenue. It functioned almost like a central bank.
Wow, a central bank.
Yeah, it maintained the social hierarchy, deciding who was clean and who was unclean. It undergirded the immense wealth and power of the high priestly families.
And we have to remember the political reality. Those high priests were operating under Roman suffragans.
Exactly. The Roman Empire allowed them to maintain this religious system and this economy as long as they kept the peace and paid their tributes.
So Jesus standing in a house declaring that sins are forgiven without a priest, without a sacrifice, and without a trip to Jerusalem is a direct, calculated threat to that entire economy.
If forgiveness is free, immediate, and portable, the temple totally loses its monopoly.
It is essentially a shadow war on the central bank of Jerusalem. When you reframe it like that, the scribes' reaction makes total sense. They are watching a man dismantle their entire socioeconomic reality with a single sentence.
It's incredibly provocative.
Now, you would think that after infuriating the religious Supreme Court, a smart strategic leader might decide to lay low for a minute, maybe build a quiet underground coalition.
You think so, yeah.
But he doesn't. He walks out of that house, goes straight to the lakeshore, and walks right up to the very mechanism of Roman oppression.
He takes the fight straight to the local infrastructure of the empire.
Right. We hit Mark 2.14. Jesus is walking along the Sea of Galilee, and he spots Levi. Levi is sitting at a tax customs booth.
And Jesus just looks at him and gives a simple two-word command: "Follow me."
And Levi simply gets up, leaves the booth, and follows. Now, this is another moment where I have to look at the strategy here. If you are trying to start a popular grassroots reform movement among oppressed peasant fishermen, recruiting a guy who actively works for the oppressive occupying empire is an absolute PR nightmare.
It really is.
It is political suicide. Why on earth hire the most hated guy in town to be in your inner circle?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the political provocation of this specific choice is massive. We need to understand how the tax system functioned.
Okay.
Levi wasn't just a government employee doing a tough administrative job. His toll booth along the lakeshore was a strategic collection post serving Herod Antipas.
And Herod Antipas is the Roman-backed client ruler of the region, the exact same guy who had already imprisoned the famous prophet John the Baptist.
Correct. The Romans didn't usually collect local tolls themselves, they farmed it out to local contractors.
So Levi would have purchased the right to collect customs revenue from the extremely busy Galilean fish trade.
Exactly. The trade moving back and forth across the lake and along the major international highway, the Via Maris, was incredibly lucrative.
And the system allowed tax collectors to extract the required quota for Herod and then legally extort additional money from their own neighbors to keep as personal profit.
Yes, and the revenue went to a regime that most Galileans viewed as violently oppressive and completely corrupt.
Levi wasn't just a guy doing his job. He was a traitor.
He was a collaborator getting rich off an occupation economy, while everyday people were being taxed into absolute poverty.
So bringing a traitor like that into the inner circle is wild enough, but it doesn't stop there. He escalates it socially.
It really does.
That very evening, Jesus is eating dinner at Levi's table. And the text makes it clear he isn't just having a quiet, private onboarding session with his new hire. He is surrounded by a whole crowd of tax collectors and people labeled as sinners or social outcasts.
Which brings up a critical rule of ancient Near Eastern culture, the sociology of the dinner table.
Well, the whole table fellowship thing.
Exactly. In this world, who you ate with broadcasted exactly who you aligned yourself with. Sharing a loaf of bread was an intimate sign of mutual acceptance and fellowship.
By eating publicly in a packed room with this specific, highly visible class of political collaborators and outcasts, Jesus is intentionally bulldozing the social boundaries.
It is a deliberate, spectacular provocation of every single purity boundary the religious elite had established.
He is practically handing his enemies fully loaded ammunition to use against him. He's communicating, I'm not just going to recruit this guy in secret. I'm going to sit down, break bread, and share a table with the exact people you consider to be literal traitors to our nation.
And as you'd expect, this highly visible alignment draws the absolute contempt of the Pharisees who are watching this happen.
Of course it does.
But you don't just eat with a collaborator in a vacuum. The local religious observers are watching this feast happen, and to them, it's not just who is at the table. It's the fact that they are throwing a feast at all during a time when everyone else is fasting.
Right, which logically triggers the next major confrontation in the chapter. The Pharisees and the disciples of John the Baptist approach him and demand an explanation about public piety.
They're basically like, what is going on here?
Yeah, they ask him point blank, why are the disciples of John fasting and the Pharisees are fasting, but your disciples are over here eating and drinking like it's a festival?
To understand the tension in this moment, we have to look closely at what fasting actually meant to the Pharisees in the first century.
Because we tend to view fasting today as a private, individual, spiritual discipline.
Right. But in their world, it was deeply public. It wasn't just a hollow religious performance to show off how holy they were.
What was it then?
Fasting was a recognized communal sign of deep mourning. It signaled repentance, and crucially, it signaled solidarity with the national suffering of the Jewish people living under the boot of Roman domination.
Wow, so they were mourning the state of their occupied nation.
Yes, it was essentially a form of silent, spiritual protest mixed with political solidarity. By fasting, they were publicly asking God, when are you going to fix this broken system?
So when Jesus' disciples aren't fasting, they aren't merely breaking a minor religious rule or forgetting a tradition.
Exactly. To the Pharisees, they are failing to show solidarity with the plight of their own nation. They are ignoring the communal grief.
And Jesus answers this serious challenge by deploying some incredibly sharp, culturally loaded metaphors.
He talks about a bridegroom being at a wedding, which implies the time for mourning is over.
Right, and he talks about sewing a new, unshrunk patch of cloth onto an old garment, and then he hits them with Mark 2.22, the famous new wine metaphor.
Oh, that one is so powerful.
He says, no one puts new wine into old wineskins or else the new wine will burst the skins, but they put new wine into fresh wineskins.
It is a brilliant, devastating peasant economy metaphor. Every single person listening to him in that agrarian society would intimately understand the exact mechanics of winemaking.
Because as new wine ferments, the yeast eats the sugars and releases carbon dioxide gases.
Exactly. The liquid violently expands. If you pour that fermenting, expanding liquid into an old, brittle leather wineskin that has already been stretched to its absolute maximum limit and dried out, the new pressure will literally tear the old leather apart.
The skin bursts, the wine spills into the dirt, and absolutely everything is ruined.
So he is using the most everyday, mundane agricultural reality to make a massive, devastating announcement about his movement.
He is quietly but firmly telling the religious elite that this new authority he is bringing has absolute fundamental institutional incompatibility with their existing religious order.
You cannot just pour his new teachings into the old, rigid containers of the temple economy, the Pharisaic purity laws, or the current rituals of fasting.
If you try to force this new movement into your old rules, the entire system will explode.
He is drawing a permanent line in the sand. He isn't here to act as a reformer who just patches up the holes in the old system.
No, he is bringing something entirely new that requires an entirely new structure to hold it. And if you thought the tension was redlining there, here's where it gets really interesting.
A big finale.
Yes. Because the chapter doesn't end on a metaphor. It ends with the ultimate physical escalation. The disciples breaking the Sabbath in the grain fields.
They're walking through the agricultural fields, and his disciples start plucking heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands, and eating the kernels.
And the Pharisees, who seem to be constantly monitoring them by this point, immediately flag it.
They say, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Because in their legal framework, plucking grain was considered a form of harvesting.
And rubbing it was threshing. Both were strictly forbidden work on the day of rest.
Exactly. And let's be clear, the Sabbath was the most heavily guarded, legally protected institution in Jewish life.
You could mess with a lot of things, but you do not mess with the Sabbath.
You do not. But look closely at the mechanism of how Jesus defends them. He doesn't get into the weeds of the law.
No, he doesn't argue about whether plucking 3 grains counts as harvesting.
Instead, he points entirely backward to a highly specific, provocative historical precedent from the book of 1 Samuel chapter 21.
He reminds these scholars of the story of David, back when David was a fugitive on the run from King Saul.
David and his men were exhausted, in desperate need and starving. So David went into the house of God at Nob and ate the consecrated bread, the bread of the presence.
Which was incredibly sacred. We are talking about 12 massive loaves of bread, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, baked fresh every week, placed before the presence of God, and lawful only for the ordained priests to eat.
No one else touches it.
Exactly. It was the height of ritual sanctity.
By invoking this specific story of David taking the holy bread, Jesus is firmly positioning himself inside a prophetic tradition of historical figures whose inherent authority actually exceeded the written ritual law.
He is telling the legal experts, David, God's anointed king, had the authority to bypass your rigid ritual law for the sake of human need and survival. I am telling you that I possess that exact same authority.
Right.
So what does this all mean? He's not just making a clever historical comparison to win a debate about harvesting wheat, is he?
No, the historical comparison is just the runway. The explosive payload drops in Mark 2.28. Jesus looks at them and says, therefore, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.
Lord of the Sabbath. Wow, that is an unbelievable, earth-shattering claim to make out loud to a group of Pharisees.
It is the sharpest, most dangerous escalation in the entire chapter. To claim lordship over the Sabbath is to directly threaten the Pharisees' specific primary sphere of social control.
They were the self-appointed regulators of communal religious practice.
But it goes so much deeper than that. The Sabbath wasn't just a mandated day of rest. It was the very institution that organized and preserved Jewish identity under the crushing weight of Roman occupation.
Because Rome could tax their fish, Rome could occupy their land, Rome could even influence their temple. But Rome could not conquer time.
Exactly. The Sabbath was their invisible sanctuary.
It was the one piece of their national soul that belonged entirely to them and to God. And Jesus looks at the men who guard that invisible sanctuary, and he essentially says, I am the one in charge of it. I own this.
He is claiming absolute, sovereign authority over the very mechanism that defines their national and religious survival. It is an unmatched claim of supremacy.
It is absolutely wild to step back and look at the progression of this text from beginning to end. When you understand the history and the mechanics behind each interaction, it completely changes how you read it.
It really does. It is not just a collection of nice stories.
No, not at all.
Because when you look at it from a high altitude, the progression of Mark chapter 2 isn't just a random series of theological debates strung together for a biography. It's a calculated, systematic, step-by-step dismantling of every single existing pillar of power in that society.
This is just brilliant.
First, he goes after the massive temple economy, by claiming the authority to forgive sins for free. Second, he intentionally shatters the social purity laws by recruiting a traitor and eating a feast with collaborators of the Roman occupation.
Right.
Third, he uses the mechanics of new wine to declare absolute institutional incompatibility with their sacred fasting rituals. And finally, he claims total sovereignty over the Sabbath itself. Jesus didn't just walk around breaking the rules, he claims sovereignty over the very institutions that made those rules in the first place.
That is just wow. Listen, we want to know what you think about this intense historical drama we just unpacked. Drop a comment below. Would you have been furious if someone tore through your carefully packed clay roof? Or would the political shockwave of bypassing the entire temple economy have distracted you from the mess? I mean, it is a wild scenario to put yourself into, right?
Oh, absolutely wild.
If you enjoyed this deep dive and you want to keep exploring the hidden mechanisms behind these ancient texts with us, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming analyses. We are building an incredible community of learners here. And definitely check the description below for exclusive links and further reading on everything we unpacked today. There is so much more historical context to explore in the sources.
So much more.
Jesus has just claimed ultimate authority over the most protected institution in Jewish life. He has dismantled their power structure in front of everyone. But what happens when the religious authorities decide they have finally had enough and lay a targeted trap for him right in the middle of the synagogue? The backlash is coming, and we'll dive into that explosive confrontation next time.